Careful. So let me introduce Anne Bandry. I hope that in the meantime we have quite a few people in the room. I see that there's enough people, so let's get started. This is wonderful. Anne Bandry is a very old friend of mine. Anne Bandry and I became professors on the same day, more or less. In Mulhouse, we got our jobs. We had the job interview on the same afternoon, I think, the way I understand it. And Anne Bandry at one point became director of the English department. She took our whole English department through this infamous LMD transformation, which was a big deal. And Anne Bandry was a very good administrator. And that's why she went to Strasbourg, because she said, when I'm in Strasbourg, I have to do less administration because there are more people, more shoulders to carry all of that administration, and I will have more freedom. So I hope she found some freedom in Strasbourg. We are very happy in Mulhouse that we have a good friend in Strasbourg who actually still lives in Mulhouse officially. And so we have this Mulhouse connection, which is absolutely wonderful. In the meantime, I have to tell you that, Anne Bandry couldn't stop doing administration, probably just because she has a certain knack for it, a certain talent. And so I am extremely proud that I'm introducing to our audience the current doyen, the dean of the arts faculty of this large university of Strasbourg. So this is somebody who knows a lot about the academic business, how universities are organized, and all that. So after I've told all of that administrative stuff, at least I have to say Tristram Shandy and Lawrence Stern. This is basically the specialty of Anne Bandry, or was when I met her, her PhD project, if I understand correctly. So Tristram Shandy is this fantastic postmodern 18th century novel. And it's absolutely wonderful, and I can recommend it to anybody. And Anne Bandry knows it extremely well. When it comes to Anne Bandry's literary criticism, all I understood is that she knows how to analyze discourse and find out who wrote the story. So there are ways, in her, period in the 18th century, there's a lot of writing which was anonymous. You didn't really have the name of the author, or you had a pseudonym. And so it's interesting for critics to find out who is the real author of a text. And so they analyze the language of a certain text, the vocabulary, certain expressions. Anne Bandry knows much more about that. And they are pretty good at finding out that there's another text written by somebody whom we know well. And then we can find out that the short story or the poem was written by author A, B, or C. And it's a kind of detective work, the way I see it. And I have a lot of respect for it. It's something really exciting. But Anne, if you want to tell us more about this, feel free to do it. Today you're going to talk about Jane Austen, and I'm extremely excited about that because Jane Austen is an important writer. We'd rather read Jane Austen than drive around in our car. As you know, that's what the bumper sticker says. So please, Anne, if there's anything else that we should know about you before you get started, tell us.
Thanks, Sami. Thanks for this kind and very friendly introduction. We've been longtime friends indeed, as with a lot of people in EUCOR, but particularly with Sami, because indeed we did get our professorships on this very same day. You mentioned Tristram Shandy. I'm interested in how stories are told, and that's why I added a subtitle to today's presentation, Playing with the Codes of Fiction. This is not usually what is associated to Austen, more to Stern, but I'm going to try to convince you that's what she's doing. By the end of our session together, the 4 pictures on my first screen should make perfect sense. Perhaps the computer is a bit intriguing, but from what you said, Sami, yes, I do count words, not necessarily for attribution, but to see how words are used. So yes, you will get a few screenshots with charts. But I want to begin with something a bit more fun and a bit more weird sometimes. Can you see the whole screen or not? Because I see my head in the upper right corner, but that can be okay. Right. So you've had the time to have a quick look at what's on the screen and what is called often Austen mania. Austen can be seen absolutely everywhere. Depends where you look, of course, but since the 90s, the mid-90s, Austen has been in a lot of places, and her popularity exists even with people who've never read a line of Austen. You see popularity with imitations, continuations, rewritings, allusions, etc. For example, with Bridget Jones' Diary, which being made into a film was even more popular. You have baby books about Jane Austen. You also have this new series that is verging on soft porn, the Bridgerton Chronicles. And you have the renowned crime writer P.D. James, whose last novel is about is a spin-off from Austen, Death Comes to Pemberley. You have Joe Baker's Longbourn, which is the story of Pride and Prejudice retold from the point of view of the servants. You have Mr. Darcy's Diaries and whatnot. Whatnot in my next slide, which is really weird material. In the years 20 something, where we had zombies everywhere, they were the craze. Well, of course, there was a Pride and Prejudice and zombies. Somebody gave it to me. I read it and passed it on to somebody else, saying I don't ever want to see that book again. But it shows that with a great book, you can do anything that is robust enough in a way. And Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters, there will be quite a lot about Sense and Sensibility today. I spoke of the mid-90s for this Austen mania, for this Austen craze. This was largely due to films, to film versions, the celebrated BBC Pride and Prejudice, which you can watch on YouTube, and of which I'm going to show a few images in a few minutes. The version with Keira Knightley, and the absolutely stunning Sense and Sensibility with Emma Thompson by Ang Lee, and that is really, really influential. It was really a landmark. I mean, the BBC Pride and Prejudice and the Sense and Sensibility by Ang Lee were really landmarks. There's a very interesting accompaniment to the film. It's Emma Thompson's screenplay and diary, because she wrote the screenplay, and she mentions an exchange with Sidney Pollack, who was the producer and of course a filmmaker himself, and he was playing the rough, naive American guy who needs to be explained things. I'm from Indiana, he said. If I get it, everyone gets it. He wanted to know why Eleanor and Marianne couldn't just go out and get a job. Why was Edward so dependent on his mother? Why he keeps his promise to Lucy when he clearly no longer loves her? Why Eleanor keeps her promise to Lucy, etc., etc. So here we see what is at work when we read a text, and particularly when a text is adapted, with a 200-year distance. I mean, my main field of research and even teaching is 18th and 19th, early early 19th century fiction. So this distance in time is constant. And this means quite a few elements of the text that were taken for granted by authors cannot be taken for granted anymore. And these very down-to-earth questions point to the adaptation work that every reader has to do, even if they're not planning on a film. These are pictures from the BBC, Pride and Prejudice with Colin Firth. This is the film that made him famous. And with the iconic scene, you've probably had the time to read the top there. The iconic scene was this, where you could see Colin Firth in a wet shirt. It was not a wet t-shirt contest, but almost. So that's what it was likened to. Not quite expected on the BBC, and it was a hit. So everybody wanted to see that picture, and it became really an iconic scene, as it says. This, if we step back a little bit, leads us to the notion of reception. That's what I've been speaking about for the last 8 slides. How does a specific person or a specific period receive a work of art? I spoke of this 200-year distance. Well, this depends, of course, on the present state of culture, and particularly on what we've read, what we've seen, what we've heard of before, which is called by a Swiss critic, Hans Robert Jauss, the horizon of expectations. What we expect because of what we've seen, read, heard, etc., etc. And a major work of art will quite often change that horizon of expectation. Now, if we hear the name Austen, we have expectations about what an Austen novel is, which I'll try to show how she builds up on the expectations of her period and to create our own expectations. So the horizon of expectations, horizon is interesting because a horizon always recedes and moves. And it gives perspective. Perspective is another word that could be used. So I've talked a bit of Austen now. We're going to go back to the publication date, 1811, when Sense and Sensibility was published. This is what it looked like. And if you want to buy a copy now, you have to pay $35,000. It's a first edition. Of course, you can buy much, much cheaper copies, and you know how to do this very well, not pay for books at all and read them on your screen. There's no more copyright there, but that's what it looked like. And it was printed, had a print run of fewer than 1,000 copies, which was already quite a lot for the period, but it was reprinted quite quickly. This is what the title page looked like. So if you have a copy at home, this is not what your title page will look like, because you'll have a name, at least, which we don't have here. We just have Sense and Sensibility, a novel, which now is a word we take for granted, but it was not the case then. In 3 volumes. We are used to reading it in 1 volume, but you saw the 3 volumes on the slide before. Volume 1, by a lady. So no author, no author's name, but by a lady. This was frequent. Not all supposed ladies were ladies, but it was a convenient appellation, denomination, and it created a horizon of expectation. It created, it referred to other novels written in the period, novels that would tell about stories of young women, usually in the British Isles, and usually ending up in a series of marriages, among which that of the heroine. That was the expectation created. The critics were actually, the reviews, sorry, were actually quite good. We're not going to read all of this, but you can read it later when you have the PowerPoint. In the critical review, just a few months after publication, the first paragraph is about the reviewer sort of complaining about the numerous novels that they have to read to give reviews, to give their opinions, and to advise on what should be read. But among these novels, if we look at the second paragraph, we are no enemies to novels or novel writers somewhere, but we regret that in the multiplicity of them, there are so few worthy of any particular commendation. Sense and Sensibility stands out, is one among the few which can claim this fair praise. What did they like? It is well written. The characters are in genteel life, naturally drawn, judiciously supported. The incidents are probable, highly pleasing, and interesting. This phrase is important because in parallel, the Gothic novel was developing and had been developing for quite some time. For example, the Mysteries of Udolpho that I will mention again later today. So when the reviewer says the incidents are probable, we don't have a Gothic novel. And we are in genteel life. We're not dealing with princes and princesses. It's not romance. And it is realistic, very similar, we would say. And then they go on with again much knowledge of character, which happily blends a great deal of good sense with the lighter matter of the piece. So this is a variation on instruct and delight. The review goes on about this moral dimension, and with a focus on character. Then the rest of the review would be extracts, long or short, depending on the space the reviewer had, and also the whether they liked the novel and wanted it to be known or not. Because Sense and Sensibility was successful, was well appreciated. Well, following 2 years later, 1813, this was supposed to appear in sequence, but I can't do it like that. Pride and Prejudice, a novel by the author of Sense and Sensibility. Fair enough. Still no name, but cashing on success. And then it's a bit small, but Mansfield Park, 1814, by the author of Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. You liked season 1, here is season 2 and season 3, just like for series. 1815, Emma, by the author of Pride and Prejudice. One is enough. And Pride and Prejudice was indeed the most successful one. Austen died very suddenly in 1817, and so her family published what was left of her work posthumously, Northanger Abbey and Persuasion. And of course they're still playing the same game, by the author of Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, etc. So really cashing on, the success of one book to sell and advertise another. A quick overview. These are the dates I gave, and we know that, like the Brontes, Austen had started writing very early, and now her juvenilia is accessible. There's even been a film entitled Love and Friendship, which is not on the short novel Love and Friendship, but in fact on Lady Susan. But you can see with the other titles why the producers would want to call it Love and Friendship, so that it would ring well with Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, rather than Lady Susan. We know that there was a first version of Sense and Sensibility, probably called Eleanor and Marianne, possibly epistolary, but nothing is left of that. But we know that she was writing what was to become her mature fiction in the mid and late 1790s. But it was only published, her texts were only published in the 1810s, basically. Still with chronology and dates, she was born and she spent her first 26 years in Steventon, Hertfordshire, where her father was a priest, a parson, and Mr. Austen suddenly decided that he had enough of Steventon and moved his family, his grown-up daughters and his wife, to Bath. In Bath, they were in rather cramped, in a small flat, because you didn't have big houses in Bath, and they were not that rich. And there, Austen could not write. Jane could not write. There was simply not enough space, no room of one's own, to paraphrase Virginia Woolf. She had no place to write. When Mr. Austen suddenly died, well, the three women, Cassandra, Jane, and their mother, were left destitute, and it was up to their brothers, because there were these two unmarried sisters, it was up to their brothers to take care of them. They were professional men, but still, it was a big expense. So the three women moved to Southampton for a while because it was cheaper than Bath. And then came a lucky strike. One of the brothers had been adopted. This was commonly done by a rich family, the Wrights, and he inherited among with other houses, but most of the village of Chawton, which is near Winchester, between Winchester and Southampton. And in Chawton, he could set up his mother and sisters in this house, which is now the Jane Austen Museum. And in Chawton, there is also, in the big house, a wonderful library where I was privileged to work for 1 month, and it's on my next photograph. When Jane Austen became suddenly very ill in 1817, she had to be taken to Winchester. Winchester is now 40 minutes drive away, but it took half a day on a carriage where she was lying down because she was very ill, and she died 3 weeks later in Winchester. So Winchester is very proud of being the town where Austen died, but she actually only spent 3 weeks, and not 3 happy weeks, in Winchester. But that's why she's buried in Winchester Cathedral. I said that she didn't have a place to write in Bath. She did have enough space in the Chawton house, and this is why she could, on this very small table, this is why she could get back to her unfinished novels, brush them up, and publish them. And there's a story, a wonderful story, which says that the room in which she wrote had a creaking door, which was never fixed because she wanted to know if anybody was entering the room, so she could hide her writing. She was rather secretive about her writing. Her family knew she wrote, of course, but she still didn't want them to see. This is the great house I was mentioning, the major property of Chawton, and they've turned this into a research center for women's writing from 1660 to 1850, early 19th century. And when you're there, you work in rooms like these, so it's very, very pleasant. I've insisted on the small scale, on the very small table, small rooms, even though you're seeing here the great house, which we suppose she went to regularly because it's literally a 5 minutes walk between this place and the house where she lived and wrote. But this was a period when the world, or at least Europe, was raging. You see the map of England, and you see Europe in 1812 with Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte, French Revolution. Sorry? Was there a question?
Maybe there was a little bit of noise. Can I ask people to shut down their microphones, possibly? Thank you.
Thank you. And so she was writing these stories while the Parisians were taking the Bastille on July 14th, 1789, the beginning of the French Revolution. When in 1793, the king was executed, Louis XVI, here called Louis Capet, just with his last name, or rather dynastic name. And I'm taking great leaps here, but for the English, the enemy, the main man they wanted to get rid of was Napoleon. So at last, when he was in St. Helena's, well, the British could say good riddance, or almost good riddance. If we look at caricatures, the ex-emperor in a bottle, they have captured him, and these crazy French will calm down and leave us be proper English gentlemen and ladies. Sounds familiar? Almost Brexit, but not quite. Celebration of Britannia triumphant. Austen had two brothers in the Navy, and her other brothers were bankers, so she knew very well what was going on in Europe. But she just chose not to write about it, and to write about a small, secluded world. Mind you, if there had been no militia in Pride and Prejudice, the story would have been quite different, because there would have been no Wickham. So we're back to Chawton. On this small scale, with the very small and very endearing table and quill. She wrote about smallness. There are very few statements about her writing, on her comments on her writing, but this is one of the most famous ones. She mentions the little bit, 2 inches wide, so about 5 centimeters, of ivory on which I work with so fine a brush as produces little effect after much labor. This is what she was referring to, these very minute and delicate miniatures, on which you could have famous people, but you could also have members of your family if you were rich enough to pay for them. And also famous scenes. So these were objects that were all around, that were everywhere, or almost everywhere, in well-off families. And this is what she's comparing her writing to. But this context is always very important. This comes in a letter to one of her nephews, who was a writer. But nobody remembers James Edward Austen, particularly as a writer. And the letter is about the fact that he has mislaid 2.5 chapters from his novel. And she's joking on the fact that she has not stolen them. What should I do with your strong, manly, spirited sketches full of variety and glow? How could I possibly join them to the little bit of ivory, etc., etc.? That's the context of the quote. But of course, we remember only the part that describes Austen's writing. I mentioned her letters. If you're interested in her letters, fascinating material. You can read them in the many Deirdre Lefay's editions, or you can read them online on what is one of the oldest, and it shows, literary websites, pemberley.com, which started in the, I think in the mid-90s, possibly even earlier than that. Another very, very famous statement that she made about her writing, this time to a niece, Anna Austen Lefroy, who was writing a novel and being advised by her famous aunt in 1814. Austen was not a very well-known writer, but a respected writer. 3 or 4 families in a country village is the very thing to work on. So that's her small world. 3 or 4 families means about 20 characters, enough to create networks, to create changing relationships, and to construct what is called a novel of manners. I have a definition, but later on. So novels of manners, this is quite often an appellation that is associated to Austen. I'll skip this because it's much too long, but you can read it later. And still writing to the same correspondent, Anna Austen Lefroy, she comments on a novelty, Waverley, but by Walter Scott. Walter Scott had been famous as a poet, and this is what she writes. But Walter Scott had been very jealous of Byron, who was not only famous in England, but famous throughout Europe. So Walter Scott actually stopped writing poetry, and for all sorts of reasons, financial among others, he started writing what is called the Waverley novels, founding, at least officially so, the historical genre. So at this period, you have the historical novel, you have the Gothic novel, and you have what can be called the novel of manners, the domestic novels like the ones of by Jane Austen. So Walter Scott, Austen complains, has no business to write novels, especially good ones. It is not fair. He has fame and profit enough as a poet, and should not be taking the bread out of the mouth of other people. I do not like him, and do not mean to like Waverley if I can help it, but fear I must she can recognize a good novel when necessary. It's tit for tat, really, because Scott is the one who made Austen a respectable and respected writer. He's the one who, as a critic, with all his weight, all the weight of his fame, by reviewing Emma when it came out in 1815, put Austen on the literary scene. So this reciprocal relationship, asymmetrical reciprocal relationship is rather interesting, I think. We therefore bestow no mean compliment upon the author of Emma when we say that, keeping close to common incidents and to such characters as occupy the ordinary walks of life, she has produced sketches of such spirit and originality that we never miss the excitation which depends upon a narrative on uncommon events arising, etc., etc. So he opposes her to Edgeworth, another contemporary writer, but also to novels with uncommon events, Gothic among the others. And she compares her to the Flemish school of painting. So that made her famous because this was printed in the Quarterly Review. Later on in his journal, he writes of rereading Austen and paying her what I find is a very comic compliment, the big bow wow strain of the historical novel, with armies and Waverley lost in the 45 events with Bonnie Prince Charlie and so on. The big bow wow strain, I can do myself like anyone going. But the exquisite touch which renders ordinary commonplace things and characters interesting from the truth and of the description and the sentiments is denied to me. I can do the big thing, but not the small thing. There was no way he could have read the Little Bit of Ivory letter that I've pointed out before. But this is exactly what he's saying. What a pity such a gifted creature died so early. He's writing in 26. She died in 1817. You've probably read that if you read the online material that I've put in chapter 5 of Northanger Abbey, which is, I'm doing nothing original here, which is often the third critical comment that Austen, which is presented as the third critical comment that Austen made on her own writing. This chapter is meta-textual, a text talking about a text, and she jokes with the fact that even in novels are described. You can read the whole extract if you've not done so already. Oh, and in a dialogue. Oh, what are you reading? And what are you reading? Oh, it's only a novel. It's only Cecilia or Camilla or Belinda, quoting Frances Burney and Maria Edgeworth, which clearly Austen greatly admired and which everybody had read. Or in short, only some work in which the greatest powers of the mind are displayed, in which the most thorough knowledge of human nature, the happiest delineation of its varieties, the liveliest effusions of wit and humor are conveyed to the world in the best chosen language. Perhaps a bit over the top, too many superlatives in a book that is about fiction itself, as I will show and as we will look at together. So she's overdoing it somewhat, but still we feel the writer who is, by overdoing it, still praising her, not necessarily her own art, but the kind of artifact she is constructing. Quite interestingly, when Choderlos de Laclos, the author of Les Liaisons Dangereuses, Dangerous Liaison, which you've probably at least all know about, and there's a good film if you haven't seen it, when he reviewed in the Mercure de France Frances Burney's Cecilia, second novel, which is a big third-person narrative. You've had time to read the French. Some of you will read the French, others won't be so comfortable. So he's praising the fact that even if the genre of the novel is not well esteemed, it's the most read. So people like it, even if critics don't or are somewhat derogatory about it. But and again, there's no way Austen could have read what he was writing, but it's really an echo. Vast conception, great interest, very subtle and profound observations, characters also in the sense of the construction of characterization rather, and sentiments are true and well sustained. So he was, of course, also a novelist himself, with an epistolary novel. He knew about, again, what he was saying. So after this look at reception, we're going now to have a look at the text together. So I hope you have the text with you. I'm going to do as if you did. So even perhaps if you have them online and you want to look at the text rather than the screen, this will be more important. Is it possible to have a bit of feedback, a bit of dialogue about what you thought, how you reacted when you read the first chapter of Sense and Sensibility? Is this possible, or is it a one-woman show?
See if somebody has something to say. It would
How
be
did you
nice if
react
students-
to the first chapter of Sensibility? I really can't say it tonight. What did it look like the beginning? What you were expecting of a Jane Austen novel? Just general impressions. That would be helpful as a way to start a discussion on the text. Yes, no? Anybody bold enough to? If there's any writing, I can't see it because I have to see my PowerPoint. So, Sammy, you'll have to tell me if anybody writes anything. No? No first impressions on...
I personally thought that was exactly what I was expecting from a Jane Austen novel. I personally only have read Pride and Prejudice up until now. I have not read the other books, but it reminded me of it because there's a description. She's talking a lot, she's giving a lot of description, and she's just it's just a very Jane Austen, like a lot of adjective, a lot of explaining what is the sort of atmosphere. So I was not very surprised at all by that first chapter.
Okay, good. Thanks for that. And thanks for the stylistic remarks as well. I'm going to speak about substantives and adjectives and description. Thank you, Sarah. Any other remarks? Yes, Maxime. Oh, I can see what you're writing. Great. Thanks. The touch of irony, of course. Thanks for that. Irony is not always easy to perceive. But we'll try to see where irony is. I don't think there's much irony, at least on the first reading. In the first chapter, which has a very serious turn, but again, possibly Austen is overdoing it a bit and drawing our attention in the first sentence, in the second sentence rather, after we've been told the family of Dashwood as an institution had long been settled in Sussex. I hope you noticed all the alliterations there. Yes, thanks. And the insistence on this family and the possessive pronoun, their estate, their residence, their property. They had lived in so respectable a manner. Perhaps this should alert us. There's a lot of seriousness there, but perhaps a bit too much, and we should be wary of this. And we have this
Actually, sorry, I have a quick question about this because you made the remark about how she says there and there. When she talks about their estate, their family, because obviously the estate always belonged to the men of the family, so mostly the father or the sons or even the cousins if there were no sons. So what do you think of her actually saying their estate as like a family and not just saying the father's estate, the husband's estate and all that? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Because she's starting from the unit, the family, and we will gradually discover who the members of this family are, and that this unity is in fact problematic and not really unity. So I think she's insisting on the institution of the family, on the institution of inheritance, with the principle of male primogeniture. Primogeniture meant that the property was passed on to the eldest child, and male, obviously, to the first male child, and if it was not a son, as you pointed out, then it was a nephew. So the family is indeed very masculine, very, very, very male, and we understand at the beginning of the second paragraph that this is going to be the main crux of the story. And we have the transition from the old gentleman, the late owner of this estate. So by line 3, we know that the owner of the estate is dead. Then we learn that his sister is dead. Not very happy opening. And then with the beginning of the second paragraph, by a former marriage, Mr. Henry Dashwood had one son, by his present lady 3 daughters. We can read this in a fairly naive way, but contemporaries would certainly at this point go, uh-oh, there will obviously be problems here, money problems, transmission, inheritance problems. So then from paragraph 2 onward, we have the division, huh? The son, the three daughters, and it's all about money, wealth, fortune, and then we have sums which can seem like big sums, but we need to keep in mind that money is presented in different ways in this first chapter. At the end of the second paragraph, lines 17, 18, their mother had nothing, so the mother of the girls, their mother had nothing, and their father only £7,000 in his own disposal. You need to add a couple of zeros to more or less transfer it into contemporary money. So it looks like a big sum of money, but in fact it had to last them for their whole life. So, and there were three of them. And then we get very technical financial details. The remaining moiety of his first wife's fortune, also secured to her child, securing money, securing property, securing inheritance was very important. And as we see in paragraph 3, this money is taken away from them, or at least the property is taken away from them. And the word secured, line 24, reappears. But to his sons and his sons' sons. In case you didn't get it about male primogeniture, here you can't escape it. It's as like a series of Russian dolls, but not female dolls. To his son and to his son's sons, a child of 4-year-old, it was secured. So the girls are safely kept out of this. We have £7,000 at the end of paragraph 2, and then to this is added £1,000 apiece at the end of paragraph 3. So smaller and smaller amounts of money, and it was fairly generous, but only fairly, because this again was for their life, and the only solution, as you probably know, was to marry, because otherwise you were a burden on your family. You mentioned, Sarah, that you had read Pride and Prejudice, and you know that this is why Charlotte marries, not to be a burden on her family, and possibly to be out of her father's house at any rate. Mr. Dashwood, the girl's father, dies. So we have in paragraph 4, so in 4 paragraphs we have 3 deaths. Basically we have death and money. Because of this death, we have a focus on the son, whose name is then developed at the beginning of paragraph beginning line 39. And then we have the description, the characterization. Austen's focus on 1 paragraph. Maxime, you mentioned irony before. I think that it's prevalent here. Well, let's read this paragraph together. I'm going to insist on some of the words. He was not an ill-disposed young man. So a negation qualifying something negative, this should lead to something positive, but it doesn't. Unless to be rather cold-hearted and rather selfish is to be ill-disposed. So he's not ill-disposed, but in fact he is ill-disposed. We're stuck in between those 2 occurrences of the word, and we cannot think otherwise than that he is ill-disposed. But he was in general well respected. Similar number of syllables, and again an echo there. And well respected echoes with line 2. They had lived in so respectable a manner as to engage the general good opinion. So he's the right hair, indeed. He keeps the family reputation as up. So well respected, for he conducted himself with propriety. That's a key word of the period. The fact that he does what is expected of him. in the discharge of his ordinary duties. What these are, we're not told. We just have to take it for granted. Contemporary readers knew. Had he married a more amiable woman, woman, he might, another M, have been made, another M, still more respectable than he was. So he's respectable, he could have been better. Well, actually, he's worse. You see the irony is at work, by building up on one word after the other, on one repetition, on a slight variation, on the use of double negation, not in an ungrammatical way, but in a very clever stylistic way, so that by the end of this paragraph we cannot possibly have a positive opinion of this not ill-disposed young man. He's going to be a villain, that's clear. And his wife even worse. She doesn't have a name at this point, she's just Mrs. John Dashwood, with a strong caricature of himself, but which is built on which we don't really know. More narrow-minded and selfish. Then after that, we have more details about money. So one character for whom money seems to be the reason to live, and who does everything that is necessary to do to increase this money. And before we are given access to the other characters, we have more about money. And here we have a very different distinction. It's at the top of the second page, lines 49, 50, when he's debating with himself with the possibility of giving them £1,000 apiece, so doubling what his uncle gave them. He then really thought himself equal to it. The prospect of 4,000 a year. So he's getting, this is his interest. By this I mean he has capital in the bank, a huge amount, and 4,000 a year is the money he can live on. The girls get £1,000 for life. They get £1,000 one time. You see the vast difference. It's not only a 1-to-4 ratio, it is much more than that. So toying with his money, toying with what he could give them, and then the confrontation. And if you've seen the Ang Lee film, this scene in which Fanny Dashwood convinces her husband, not to give them anything at all, is set up in an extremely funny way. They look really like, it's almost like slapstick comedy. Then we have the clash between the two women, Mrs. Dashwood and Mrs. Dashwood, and the passage. This leads us to the three girls, characterization again, the description of Elinor, then the description of Marianne, and then the description of Margaret. Again, when Maxime, when you wrote about irony, you focused on this passage. Elinor, line 68, this eldest daughter, whose advice was so effectual, should we take this at face value or not, possessed a strength of understanding and coolness of judgment. We have substantives for Elinor. Qualified her to be the counselor of her mother, so a reversal of relationships there. And then a few nouns, a few verbs, to counteract. And then nouns again. She had an excellent heart. Her disposition was affectionate, the adjective. Her feelings were strong. She knew. She's the one who knows. And this is developed into a substantive. Again, it was a knowledge which her mother had yet to learn, and which one of her sisters had resolved never to be taught. So Elinor is associated to abstraction, through substantives. This is particularly apparent if we read through Marianne's characterization. Marianne's abilities, substantives, were in many respects quite equal to Eleanor's. She was sensible, with sense, and clever, but eager in everything. Sorrows, joys, moderation. She was generous, amiable, interesting. An empty word, but interesting was not yet an empty word. Interesting, she was everything but prudent. So Marianne is qualified mainly by adjectives and Eleanor by substantives. Eleanor is then associated to verbs, particularly after the substantives with the next paragraph, the excess of her sister's sensibility, word from the title. Then we have a series at the end of this paragraph of could. No? She's the one who is able to. Eleanor too was deeply afflicted, but still she could struggle, she could exert herself, she could consult with her brother, could receive her sister-in-law, treat her with proper attention, could strive, etc., etc. So she's the doer. She's the leader of the family. And by the end of this first chapter, we know that. We need a third sister for balance. We need a third sister in the novel. She's not used very much. She serves to bring in embarrassing information because she doesn't know it is embarrassing. But in the Ang Lee and Emma Thompson movie, this character is transformed into a much more interesting character as a child, and as the child who asks the kind of questions that Sidney Pollack was asking. There's a wonderful scene with a treehouse when she questions male primogeniture. And so Eleanor explains, which is absolutely not in the book, but is necessary for late 20th century and early 21st century viewers, why the daughter cannot inherit, why daughters cannot inherit. But here she's definitely not put in a very positive light. Good-humored, okay. Well-disposed, okay. But as she had already imbibed a good deal of Marianne's romance, not something very positive as we've seen, without having much of her sense, so she has sensibility but no sense, she did not at 13 bid fair to equal her sisters at a more advanced period of life. So the third sister is discarded. We can contrast this with the beginning of Pride and Prejudice, into which I will not go, which is a very lively dialogue. Here we have this third person narrative voice. We are more or less pushed into believing or half believing this is Austen, but let's remain on safe ground and speak of narrative voice. We have no indication of whether it is a male or female voice. It's just a voice, the voice that gives comments on the story and that constructs the story. Now I would like to focus on playing with conventions. We've mentioned irony a bit. I've mentioned meta-textuality at some point, and we're going to look at the way she's playing with conventions. Our first convention will be the picturesque. Are there any questions or comments so far? I guess I'll turn my light. No, you can't see me then, can you? That's better. Drink.
Okay. I'm enjoying your comments. This is very exciting.
Thank you. So I take it that you've read chapter 18, the extract, and I'm just going to give you a bit of background on the picturesque, because this is what it's all about. In chapter 18, we have Edward, Eleanor, and Marianne discussing about the picturesque. The picturesque was one of those words we are told in the passage, but it's one of those words that were becoming absolutely banal. In Chawton, I read a travelogue by one of Austen's brothers, who goes to France and to Switzerland, and anything almost every day. He's not a writer. In each day's entry, each time he mentions landscape, he uses the word picturesque. Clearly it was the word to use, and he doesn't realize that he's just overdoing it a bit. And when his sister was overdoing things, she knew what she was doing. I don't think he knew what he was doing. So the picturesque is often opposed to the sublime. You'll read the texts later. Sublime as defined by Burke, for whom in the mid 18th century, the sublime is associated to pain, to grandeur, and we should feel very, very small in front or confronted with or inside a sublime landscape. And the sublime is opposed to the beautiful. Sublime objects are vast in their dimensions, beautiful ones comparatively small. Beauty should be smooth and polished, the great rugged and negligent. Beauty should shun the right line. Hogarth had spoken of the serpentine line before. Yet deviate from it insensibly. So for the beautiful, you have subtlety. Beauty should not be obscure. Beauty should be light and delicate and associated to pleasure rather than pain. This is what they are speaking of. The three characters are discussing, and they are particularly discussing Gilpin, William Gilpin's 3 essays on picturesque beauty. And I told you before that the first version of this novel had been written most probably in the late 1790s. This was when Gilpin published his work. And here you have the elements, the ingredients of landscapes. Trees, rocks, broken grounds, woods, river, lakes, plains, valleys, mountains, and distances. This is what you need, the elements of a picture. And variety, combination, lights. And he opposes the sublime and the picturesque. Sublimity alone cannot make an object picturesque. Well, he seems to be mixing notions a bit, but it's clearer in the second essay. What do we need? An atmosphere, various effects, the inanimate face of nature. I've read the list before. Also the living forms, human figures shown in action as they were taken on the spot. This is before photography, of course. So it had to look natural, and it had to look like a picture. Then it became a picture in the eyes of the viewer, even if no picture was drawn. But you could draw a picture because it was picturesque. You see the entanglement there. So animals, in short, every form of life and being may have its use as a picturesque object till it becomes too small for attention. So don't go for bugs. Ruins as well. And we pursue beauty in every shape, admire it in the grandest objects, and not rejecting it in the humblest, because the characters were not princes and princesses, but shepherds and shepherdesses. This could only be perceived by people with enough sensibility. I've mentioned the word sensibility before. I've mentioned photography, so there's a strong link there. What if you are endowed with sensibility, what you see impresses you, impresses on you. And so this word sensibility, like the picturesque, was everywhere. I said I would show graphs. So here is a graph. A corpus of 43 novels by women writers from the Chorlton collection, so not famous novels and some famous novels, among which Sense and Sensibility, which is here. We see the use of the word sensibility. When it's in red, particularly over the dotted line, it means it's used more than average in the corpus. And Sense and Sensibility is not a novel where this word is used more. But this word was fashionable and all over the place at this period. Belinda was published in 1802. So Sense and Sensibility is published, even though it was probably written earlier, as I said, but Sense and Sensibility is published when the craze is past. And I had a very close look in a research based on this, at this text, Rachel, which is a short didactic novel, and again, like Austen, plays with the word sensibility. I see the time, so I'm not going to go over this, but this is what Jane Taylor, the author, does with sensibility. Does sensibility teach you to crush a snail to death with your foot rather than save their lives by touching them with your finger? It's simple. It's for teenagers, for youth. But this author, even later than Austen, is playing with the word to tell young women, young girls even, that, okay, don't be over sensitive, don't overplay sensibility. It is ridiculous. Just be a sensible girl, for God's sake. Sensibility and sense, when they are used together, so sensibility in blue, sense in red. Sometimes you see both words, for example, in this novel called Agnes. In Rachel, sensibility is high, sense as well. In Sense and Sensibility, you have the two words, but as for almost every feature that is strongly present among her contemporaries, Austen does less of everything. So this is what you can see with a computer with graphs. I'll skip this, you can read it later. It's about sensibility. And in her early writing, Love and Friendship, you can write this, but let's just read the end. From an excess of sensibility for which we were always remarkable, I cannot now determine, but certain it is that when we had reached our 15th year, we took the 900 pounds and ran away. So she's making fun of sensibility before she entitled her novel, or her novel was entitled for her, Sense and Sensibility. So we're dealing with words just like the picturesque, which are conventions. And it's not necessarily easy for us to perceive this. They were hackneyed words. Oops, that's for a bit later. So now we can look at chapter 18 and the discussion about the picturesque. We have Marianne. No, we have Edward, goes for a walk, describes what he's seen, but challenges Marianne. That's line 7, 6. Remember, I have no knowledge in the picturesque. Marianne has, before that, we have a passage where she raves about the dead leaves at the house that they have to leave. Here they are in Devonshire, where Edward visits them. And we have two clashing views of the picturesque. So my point is that Austen is playing with conventions. And he has the vocabulary. I shall call hills steep, which ought to be bold. Ought, if you respect the picturesque mode, the picturesque vision, the picturesque specs, the picturesque frame. So hills, which ought to be bold, surfaces strange and uncouth, which ought to be irregular and rugged. Interestingly, these were the words used by Burke for the sublime rather than the picturesque. Distant objects out of sight, which ought to be indistinct through the soft medium, etc. She then, Marianne is then overdoing it with calling it a mere jargon. We have the jargon of the picturesque, and you've had the texts of the picturesque, and now you have the jargon of the picturesques. And so in the middle of these two characters, both excessive, one underdoing things and the other overdoing things, you have sensible Eleanor. And Austen is playing with the construction of these three characters to make fun of conventions of her time, as evidenced by the writings of Austen's brother. This word was all over the place, as I said. So she's making fun of her own readers at the same time, and playing with conventions. Any comments on that, possibly, or questions before we move on to a more or less equivalent passage in chapter 14 of Northanger Abbey? Okay, I've not lost you. Oh, good. Northanger Abbey, you probably know about from the title. You see that the Gothic dimension is strong. Again, it's a construction on the Gothic, satire, comic satire. Not all satires are comic. A comic satire on the Gothic. Again, playing with construction. But before that, we have the first part, which takes place in Bath. And as I pointed out before, Austen really knew about Bath. First part which takes place in Bath, and in which Catherine, the heroine, is confronted to two sets of friends. One unworthy set of friends, but she doesn't know at the beginning, and one worthy set of friends, set of siblings, the Tilneys, and she will end up marrying Henry Tilney. So there's a strong didactic part, in a way, didactic for the reader, but through learning how to decipher irony, and didactic for the character, sort of mise en abîme of, let's see what characters can teach one another, and a master to his pupil who will become his wife. So in chapter 14, they're going for a walk, and we're in nature, but not very far from Bath. We have the presence of the narrator, line 5. My heroine was most unnaturally able to fulfill her engagement, though it was made with the hero himself. And we don't quite know what to do, I think, with the description we have at the end of this paragraph. Beach and cliff, that noble hill whose beautiful verdure and hanging coppice render it so striking an object from almost every opening in Bath. It looks like a tourist brochure. That's probably what it's meant to be. It's a sort of over the top. I've used this expression several times, this phrase several times. Is this for the readers? Is this for the characters? We don't really know, but it definitely impresses Catherine duly, but who sends us to a book rather than a landscape, to the equivocation of the south of France. And the south of France is from the novel Mysteries of Udolpho's. Then ensues the discussion on novels, but we'll skip that. We'll keep it for later. And I want to go to the end, to lines 90. That's on page 6, so you have to turn quite a few pages. And the point I'm making is that Austen is playing the picturesque game again and drawing our attention to construction. But here, the construction, we're not only in the discussion within, among characters, with one who is in favor and one who is against, to put it mildly, the picturesque. We have a young man instructing a young woman, telling a young woman how to look at a landscape, which is only created through words because we're in a text. Contemporary readers would have seen pictures of beach and hill, so quite a lot of them would know what it looked like. We don't. Some of us do because we've been there or seen pictures, but we have the construction of a landscape through words, with the additional touch of telling one character telling another character how she should see, how she should look at and see that picture. So it's that landscape, to make it into something picturesque. So we have a series of frames there. I hope you were able to follow me. And we're not going to spend time reading the text. I just want to focus on line 114 at the bottom. She soon began to see beauty in everything admired by him. So he has transposed his frame into her head, and she can see the way he sees. So he will marry her. And her attention was so earnest that he became perfectly satisfied of her having a great deal of natural taste. He talked of foregrounds, distances, second distances, side screens, perspectives, lights, and shades. So more abstract vocabulary than we had before in Sense and Sensibility, because it's not a discussion. It's a connoisseur who is throwing words, throwing notions at somebody who is rather naive and ready to listen to him because she is falling in love with him. So we move from adjectives that we had before to substantive and abstractions. And clearly Austen is making a side with the narrative voice, and we have big winks. Look, don't be as naive as Catherine, but perhaps not so much be a prig. Don't be so much of a prig as Henry. Be the Eleanor in between, but see all the frames. See the construction, see the ropes. You see why I come from Tristram Shandy to Austen. But Northanger Abbey is more famous for, more remembered for the Gothic part. The Gothic, you know about the Gothic, but a few illustrations, a few definitions. You can go back to them later on if you wish. The Gothic is pointed. If you're in Strasbourg you go into the Straßburg Cathedral, you definitely have an extraordinary example of Gothic. And in Terry Eagleton's words, the Gothic includes the past. The family is certainly not a haven, but a cockpit of murderous loathings. Sorry, there's an H missing there. And a world of kitsch and sensationalism full of creaking plot machinery and outrageously improbable devices. So definitely over the top as well, but in a different way. And Austen is playing with that. Here are the characteristics of the Gothic. And when Catherine and Isabella read novels together, which gives way to the metatextual passage I mentioned earlier in chapter 5, when they discuss a series of novels, or they intend to read a series of novels. Catherine, who is much more naive than Isabella, are you sure they'll they are all horrid. The worst, the better. They're looking for sensational novels there. First Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto, but I'll skip that. You can read this later on. So I've insisted on construction of the gaze, construction of the story, and you can take Austen at first degree, but what a pity. You can enjoy Austen far more if you step back and if you see the ropes she shows us. And she shows us these ropes by overdoing things, by insisting, and at the same time by being very terse, by managing to do both things at once. Now I'm going to step back a bit and finish on what I call the genres of Austen's fictions. A few of these notions I've used before. These I'm basically throwing definitions at you. Marion Butler, who is an important Austen scholar and puts Austen in her context, defines these novels where you have my heroine. I'm quoting from what we read before, so these texts focusing on young women and their maturation as the feminine novel, domestic comedy, so domestic at home, 3 or 4 families in a country village, comedy, nobody dies, and we expect a happy ending, centering on a heroine in which the critical action is an inward progress towards judgment. Not everybody liked and likes those kinds of text. The Brontes were famous for not liking them, particularly Charlotte Bronte. She had a strong dislike of Austen, but also the recent critic James Raven, who has, with his partners Peter Garside and Rainer Schöverling, and also another very interesting scholar called Anthony Mandel, he described these novels as domestic dramas where heroines blush, swoon, or face unbearable social ostracism because of minor breaches of decorum. So you can see this in a ridiculous light, and I can perfectly understand that you can dislike Austen. It's okay to dislike Austen. She's not you don't have to enjoy an author that many people enjoy. So this is one way of considering her fiction and the fiction of her period. I've used earlier the phrase novel of manners, and I will use it again when later in the term I speak of George Eliot. A type of novel which dissects the social conventions and behaviors of certain social groups, 3 or 4 families in the country village, for example. It can focus on a broad social spectrum, limit itself to domestic life. And in a critical book I like very much by Patricia Mayer Spacks, Experiments in 18th Century Fiction, she describes those novels as having the structure of romance, so love stories, incorporating data from the literal social world, so a realistic dimension of verisimilitude. And it's this combination, the description, fairly static, of a social group with a trajectory, the structure of romance, characters falling in love and marrying in the end, but also, if we tie this to what Butler wrote about the feminine novel, a centering on the evolution, the growing up of the main character, usually a young woman. So a mixture of several genres, several ways to write fiction that ends up in being quite unique But what are manners? Novel of manners, what are manners? When we can have several definitions. Manners could have a bad reputation, as for example, when Samuel Johnson, who was an essay writer, a dictionary writer, and a very subtle analyst of the mid-18th century, commenting on Lord Chesterfield's letters to his son, so we're in the male sphere here. The son was an illegitimate boy, which he was turning into a courtier. My object is to have you fit to live, which if you are not, I do not desire that you should live at all. Rather cruel. So he writes to his son about what he should do and not do. For example, never smile because you show your bad teeth. Listen more than you talk. Learn how to dance. And Johnson judged that he was teaching his sons the morals of a whore and the manners of a dancing master. So manners are about etiquette, about codes, about behavior. So a novel of manners is exploring the behaviors of a group of people linked to their time and to their chronotype, to their time and place in which the fiction is developed. I find this very interesting that Burke, reacting to the French Revolution I mentioned earlier, wrote that manners are of more importance than laws. These crazy, bloody French, with their revolution, need laws, new laws. They're changing, reorganizing the world. But for Englishmen who have imbibed the good manners, then they don't need laws. They just are gentlemen and gentlewomen. They know how to behave. And as Tony Tanner points out, this is the crux of Austen's novels, knowing the rules. So knowing the rules to behave with propriety, to behave well, to be able to function in society, but also knowing the rules, as I pointed out earlier, the rules of fiction and the rules, seeing the artificiality of rules, for example, with the picturesque and the Gothic. So Tanner calls Austen's fiction the hermeneutics of manners, thinking about, learning about manners, making them. I'm sure from what I've been saying before that the term Bildungsroman has come to your mind when I spoke of the maturation, the growing up of young characters. Well, Bildungsroman, you have a definition here. You know this. I don't know at which stage the different students are, but attending this lecture, but it's usually a notion that you know. But I'm usually this term is associated to the German, to the narrative in German, Wilhelm Meister. But Moretti makes the point, the critic, Italian critic Moretti, who went on to do much more elaborate charts than I do, but with the same kind of methods. Moretti makes the point that Austen's fiction, particularly Pride and Prejudice, but not only Austen's fiction in general, is also belongs also to the Bildungsromans genre. And you probably remember that if you look at the date of Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre, this was when Austen was preparing what was to become the novels we now know. So it was the sort of the gist, the spirit of the period. And Moretti makes the point. I think we can really link this to what was in my earlier slides about novel of manners, but also the feminine novel. Otherwise, I wouldn't have put those different slides together, of course. But it's how the Bildungsroman tells the story of the individual learning to fit within society. And this is not an easy process. The conflict between the ideal of self-determination, what the teenager thinks they can decide for themselves, and some of these decisions are very important to make indeed. We've all been through this, and for those of us who are parents, we've all been through our children's teenage and sometimes very rash decisions. So the ideal of self-determination and the equally imperious demands of socialization. And if there's tension between those two processes, if there's tension, there's room for a story. And there's room for many variations on this same story, on the same storyline. Austen's novels provide some of these variations, and we know many others, but they are definitely, I contend, following this pattern of the Bildungsroman. More of Moretti, and this is my final slide. So, unless I have deadened your wit, if you have questions, if you have remarks, if you have questions about the text, or remarks to make, compliments, etc., I'm sure, Maxime, you have many other things to say about Austen. Now is the time. We have 25 minutes left.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you so much. This is really very nice. It's been lots of fun to listen to you. We got all kinds of interesting new ideas, and I'm very happy about that. So yes, just as you said, let's look for questions and see if we have any reactions from our students. Anybody who would like to ask a question?
Or make a comment.
Or make a comment, yes. Okay, Wolfgang has a question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an Austen specialist at all, but your presentation, which I enjoyed a lot, shows how innovative Austen was and how different also from the sort of run-of-the-mill stuff that was going on at the same time. Is that enough to explain the Austen mania, really? I mean, you were quite so low key on what these people actually do. Have you ever been to Bath in early September when everybody dresses up in the period garb and throngs the streets with Austenish behavior, and there are people who will tell you the last bit of what Jane Austen possibly wore on which day of the year. You know, so that's quite amazing. I mean, not to say crazy, but and I'm reluctant to just call that typically British. You know?
Well, I remember you telling us stories about people dressing up, German people dressing up as Indians and living in Indian camps. So I think it's creating a fictional environment and enjoying it, projecting yourself in a fictional environment that is coherent and that, like the picturesque and the Gothic, you can draw up with a few details. You just need the right artifacts, the right clothes, and you can make believe. It's a fairy world.
Yeah, but there's no such thing, for instance, for Scott.
Not that I know of. Well, there might be recreations of Waverley and Rob Roy and so on and so forth, but I think this is just crossing my mind now, but because of her insistence on the picturesque and the Gothic and visual aspects, because of her knack for descriptions. In 5 lines, she creates not only a character but also a world, a landscape. Then it's easy to sort of blow up these miniatures, these little bits of ivories into a bubble, into a make-believe world. And so it was easy to make the films. Austen mania comes from the films. Our Austen mania comes from the films, and because you've seen the film, then you read the book, and after the book you want to read another book, and you want to know about Darcy's thoughts, diaries, and all sorts of things. And I think there are few enough characters that people can actually project themselves in this group of friends rather than crowd. That might be it. And the possibility for multi-layered reading. I mean, I've taught Austen very often, and I now teach it in the 3rd year because it's not fun teaching, or it's too much fun teaching it in the 1st year, because you have some young women who really believe in Austen and really think that, yes, it was, and possibly still is, a good moral lesson. And they're horrified when we show them, well, not exactly, that's not exactly what she's doing. She's doing quite the reverse, actually. And she's making fun of you. So they don't like that.
Okay. Thank you for the question and for the answer. That was very exciting. I see Mai also has a question.
Yes, thank you very much for the lecture. I was wondering, you talked about Charlotte Bronte disliking Austen. I was wondering how or what the reason for this is. Was she just against the way she instructed young girls, or what was her problem with it?
The Brontes liked Yorkshire, liked wild, sublime landscapes. And she thought that Austen's world was very stuffy. Its characters are often inside. If there are outside, as we saw, they are looking at landscape in very restricted or almost ordained ways. And if you've read Bronte, particularly Wuthering Heights, even Jane Eyre, you have these characters who cannot stand the carcans in which they are, and who make things explode in a mild way with Jane Eyre, in a very violent way in Wuthering Heights. So that minute scale, the bit of ivory, I think was just too much of a constraint for Bronte. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
And I know quite a few people who, and some very close friends, and a colleague in Strasbourg with whom I talk of literature very often, he doesn't say I can't stand Austen, because he enjoys reading her for the style, but he gets bored very quickly. Whereas I must say that I disliked Austen when I read her at 20, but I was really into Sterne and into texts that played with metatextuality and textual games, etc. I think I didn't have enough literary knowledge. Perhaps didn't have the subtlety, but the first Austen, the Austen I read then was Emma. And so it's a bit different, because you have a heroine with whom you can't really sympathize. So it took me a long while to like Austen and to enjoy Austen and to relish all the level of reading that she provides, and all the very subtle irony and all the nastiness as well. I mean, when you read the description, the characterization of poor John Dashwood, I mean, he's cooked from the beginning, isn't he? There's no way we're going to relate positively to that character. Age, I suppose.
Excellent. Yes. Thank you for sharing this. This is very exciting. I see Astu also has her hand up. Astu, can you open up your microphone and ask a question?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor.
Get closer to the microphone and speak loud.
Okay, thank you very much for this brilliant presentation. I think I learned a lot, Jane Austen. Just I have one or two questions. For example, as she mentioned, Austen's juvenile. My question was whether Austen's juvenile had some effect in her mature works. That was my question, because I have noticed that that was the case for the Bronte sisters. Now I don't know whether this is the case for Austen. And another question maybe whether we can argue that Jane Austen's novels contain some biographical items. I'm not sure about the other novels, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, or Emma, but in Persuasion, which I read 2 or 3 years ago, I mean, we can find some, for example, in the setting, we have Bath, we have great house, which are real places in England. And if we consider also the heroine of Persuasion, we have there a spinster, I don't know whether Jane Austen was really describing, her own life or something like that. So this is what I want you to come back to, please, because this is her novel that I read. So thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. I'll start with the second question. Something interesting is happening in literature right now and in literary criticism. My generation, possibly particularly in France, we were trained to say, never even think that there is something biographical in fiction. It's not what you want to look at. You want to look at the text, the death of the author, and so on and so forth. I think we can now be more subtle than that. And I used the notion of verisimilitude, of realism, several times. So I don't know if she was describing her own life, and but she was certainly recreating in her fiction a world she knew, the world of genteel families, upper middle class families. And when she, at the beginning of Sensibility, talks of girls who are without money, well, she was just there describing her own situation. She was herself in that situation, and so was her sister. So she knew what he was talking about. Mm-hmm. But I've never really. I'm going to be a bit blunt. I'm sorry. I'm not really interested in knowing whether there are some autobiographical facts in her fiction or not. That's not why I read Jane Austen. But certainly fiction anchored in the environment she knew and the environment she lived in. That's for certain. For the first question about juvenilia, what we do know, and when we read the juvenilia, we laugh and we're surprised because she is sardonic. She grew up, here I'm going back to biography, but she grew up in a house full of boys, teenage boys, because she had 4 brothers, I think. And Mr. Austen had opened a school to have more money. So she grew up in a house full of teenagers, and she clearly had to compete with the boys in terms of wit. And we knew that she wrote we know, sorry, that she wrote. We know that she read her fiction, and she obviously wanted to make people laugh. I just gave a page. Sure. Thanks, Wolfgang, for attending, for being there. I'm looking forward to seeing you soon again, for real, not on the screen. So she was she was a clown, and her writing. She used her writing to compete with the boys, and read this to the family, and everybody laughed because they all knew the conventions, because they were reading these novels. The Austens were avid novel readers, and she's extremely cruel. And these stories go very, very quickly. There is one that is about a page long, in which by line 3, I really quote from sketchy memory, but the parents, the grandparents, etc., everybody's dead. By line 5, the young women have stolen money. By line 10, they are married, and by line 15, they are dead. So she's playing with the conventions of these stories. And Northanger Abbey was published in 1818 posthumously, but it was written much earlier than that, and it was ready for publication in 1803, but didn't get published. She sold it to a publisher, but had to buy it back because the publisher didn't bring it out. Nobody knows why. And the fact that in Northanger Abbey we have this playing with rules probably shows it to be an intermediary novel between this and what is called the mature fiction. And in my third year class, I like to have the students read either Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility, so that they know what a real novel, a proper novel, Austen novel is. And then we work on Northanger Abbey to insist on conventions, etc. But they need something to work on. So the Juvenilian transpires through her mature writing, but with irony, with terseness, very short episodes, or very short condensed descriptions. We don't know what she would have gone on to write had she lived longer. Perhaps as a respected writer, she would have brought this more back into her writing. There's no way to know that. But clearly, she could only be published when she had toned this down and learned how to read in this very terse style and to build this very coherent world. Her juvenilia, is wild and creates wild worlds. Getting mixed up there. And whereas she learns to take that out, but it was probably a necessary process to play with rules, to make fun of the rules, and to learn how to turn these rules, to bend these rules to her own advantage, and to make her own rules.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Anne. That was exciting. A very good answer. A lot of good questions. I'm extremely happy with the way the evening went today. So, félicitations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.